All right, welcome to the Philosopher's Clearinghouse, premium thought at a wholesale price. I'm your host, Romans 918. Thank you for joining us. Um, this might be one of the most intense lectures in the Herman Bavinck Reading Group series. This is session 12 of 13. So the 12th and penultimate lecture in the series, and it is on the person, philosophy, and theology of Enlightenment thinker Søren Kierkegaard. I hope you enjoy.
All right, good. I'm going to mute myself here so you don't hear me chewing while I eat. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's get started then. And we'll also, it'll also be great as other folks get on, but we do have a lot of material to go through in very little time. So without further ado, let me just welcome each person here and say thank you for coming. It is a joy to be here with you. It's an honor. It's a pleasure. And I am so happy to be here talking with you about such an interesting topic tonight. So, this is the 12th session of the Herman Bavinck Reading Group. And we are at the end that is not quite the end. We will have a baker's dozen. We will have a 13th episode. So, but we're late in the fourth quarter and we're actually, at the end of the commitments. So I want to thank everybody for sticking around, and what a ride it has been. And I think perhaps this session might even be one of the most intense rides in this lecture series. So let's get started. Please pray with me. Oh, Heavenly Father, we ask you to come into our hearts and into our minds. Lord, let your Spirit come down to us and dwell amongst us and live within us. Lord God, we pray for honor and wholesomeness and goodness. We pray for right words, fitly spoken. We pray for godliness in the inmost places. Lord, thank you for this evening. Thank you for this time together with friends. Thank you for this reading group. I pray for blessings for each person, Lord, and thank you. Help me to speak goodly. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Well, if you have your copy of the scriptures handy, I would invite you to turn to Psalm 133, Psalm 133. And it is a song of ascents of David, or a song of ascents, I should say, of David. And I will start with verse 1. How good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. It is like precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard, running down on Aaron's beard, down on the collar of his robe. It is as if the dew of Herman were falling on Mount Zion. For there the Lord bestows his blessing, even life forevermore. Amen. What a beautiful psalm. Well, let's transition here into our slides and into our presentation for tonight. We will be talking, of course, about one of the final concluding figures of the Enlightenment. I say concluding figure, even though he was a contemporary relatively early in the Enlightenment, so in the generation after Kant. So he was a contemporary of Hegel, and a contemporary of Feuerbach and Schelling, and some folks in that immediate aftermath of the post-Kantian revolution in thought, and very much a culmination and an important one in the Enlightenment. You almost can't leave him out without doing a major disservice to your overview of the Enlightenment. He's that important. And we hope to be charitable with our reading of him tonight and with our discussion regarding him and his thought and his philosophy, and even, dare we say, his theology. That will be one of the points in question. But even as we go through this section and this session tonight, and even as I pray and ask for charity, I do want to be clear enough that there are some very controversial things about Kierkegaard. And we will have an evaluation at the end, as well as a little bit throughout the discussion session. But let me just say up front, so that folks who hear this charitable interaction regarding his thought don't mistakenly conclude that it is an endorsement of Kierkegaard's philosophy or an endorsement of everything that he said. There's a lot of controversy here, and in the evaluations, we'll give a measured, tactical opinion that accepts some of what he has to say and rejects much of what he has to say as not being fit for Christian orthodoxy, and we'll have to talk about what that means. But having said all that, let's just get into it, and let's start talking about this immensely important figure. Next slide. Okay, we'll start off with resources. These are our standard 3 resources from the past few sessions. Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, Volume 1, Prolegomena. What a bedrock. What a foundational volume. What a great work to anchor your dogmatics in. And Bavinck has come through here, serving as a cornerstone, as a reference point for us to understand and talk about so much of the Enlightenment. In addition, I'd like to commend the Cambridge History of 19th Century Philosophy, as well as the Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics, which had a helpful encyclopedic article about Kierkegaard. Next slide. In addition, here's some additional resources that I found very pleasant to read and also extremely helpful. So, Søren Kierkegaard, the entry about him at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is well written and a great overview of this very important man's works. I also wanted to reference an article on Anselm, because we will contrast. One of the important points tonight will be to contrast some of the thought of Kierkegaard with the thought of Anselm and the earlier pre-Enlightenment categories and understandings of key concepts, especially regarding faith and what it is and what is its role in the human life that it plays. Finally, a very interesting aspect of Kierkegaard's thought, the night of faith or the night of infinite resignation. And wow, is that going to be an interesting discussion when we get to that section. So next slide. Let's go through some of these videos. These are amazing videos, and in fact, I would especially like to commend the third video on this list as being an important source for most, much if not most, of the lecture content tonight. So my deepest regards and credit given to the folks, the fine folks who authored that third video. So we have the first video, The Life and Work of Kierkegaard as a Socratic Task. This is great stuff. A very good highbrow discussion about Kierkegaard from a philosopher who is in residence at the Kierkegaard Institute in Copenhagen. And then the second video, From the Aesthetic to the Leap of Faith, Søren Kierkegaard. Very helpful. The third video we mentioned already, The Religious Solution. Much of this lecture tonight will talk about the three spheres of influence that Kierkegaard considered in his thought, or sort of three spheres. For those from a Dutch background and a Dutch Reformed background, you might think of them as something similar to the spheres of sovereignty. And so that's a good, rough, crude approximation, but of course there are many differences from that. So if it's a helpful starting place, that's good. But there's more to it than that, and the religious solution really puts that forward well. And then finally, a nice introductory, easy on the mind, good summarization of Kierkegaard in the fourth video. So again, commended. Next slide. Now finally, Kierkegaard is a intense, up and down, back and forth dogfight, roller coaster ride, punch in the mouth. What can you say? You are not the same after trying to wrestle with Kierkegaard here. And so, interestingly enough, in the spirit of levity and some humor, there are some videos that are actually sort of relevant for maybe putting one in the mood or the mindset to consider some of these concepts. So the first one, we'll talk just briefly about Kierkegaard and the ironic. And so there was, of course, a music video from Alanis Morissette singing her song by the same title, Ironic, that's very helpful in getting you in the mood to think in a Kierkegaardian fashion. Cage the elephant, ain't no rest for the wicked. So there is a, when considering existentialists such as Kierkegaard or Nietzsche in this Enlightenment period, you have this mixing of the profane and the sacred in their thought. And this song really gets down to it. When we think about thinking as Kant prescribed to kick off the modern revolution in philosophy, there was a presumption that this was a fairly straightforward thing, and that it was done and can be done from good motives and with noble intent. And we find out throughout the Enlightenment thought, as thinkers wrestled with these topics, that that's far from the case and far from obvious. And so these two videos, Ain't No Rest for the Wicked and I Can't Get No Satisfaction, have to do with Søren Kierkegaard's concept of angst, or despair, which he related to the Christian concept of original sin and a condemnation as the human condition. Next slide. So getting started right into it, Kierkegaard was born into a world that was undergoing a rapid and radical change that we today call the modern world. And in a relative sense, compared with change in society and change in technology and change in society from previous centuries, there's a pace and a scale that just takes one's breath away. What perhaps maybe took centuries to develop now in Kierkegaard's lifetime only takes a few years. Values, mores that used to be static now appear to be fluid and changing. And this sort of leads to this crisis of modernity. How can a person adjust to and respond to a new world that is constantly unfolding, constantly becoming, and will continue to do so in the foreseeable future? And so Kierkegaard saw himself perhaps as a critical voice in this new modern world, and we will get in and explore what that means. Next slide. Chief amongst the Kierkegaard notions to consider is this idea of subjectivity, and this is the relationship of relative and absolute, of knowledge and reality in light of perspective and in light of morality. So I'm reading a quote from Paul Holmer, and he said Kierkegaard's constant and lifelong wish, to which his entire literature gives expression, was to create a new and rich subjectivity in himself and in his readers. Unlike authors who believe that subjectivity is a hindrance, Kierkegaard contends that only some kinds of subjectivity are a hindrance. He sought to produce subjectivity if it were lacking, to correct it if it were there and needed correction, to amplify and strengthen it when it was weak and underdeveloped, and always to bring subjectivity of every reader to the point of eligibility for Christian inwardness and concern. So we are going to, just as in the golden age of discovery that preceded the Enlightenment, where explorers from the Western world went out into the larger oceans, and great explorers, Magellan, Columbus, Cook, and others, went and mapped the known world, the exterior world. So too Kierkegaard is, in a sense, a Christopher Columbus or a Captain Cook or a Magellan of the inward world. And so let's continue the quote here, next slide. But the edifying discourses, though paralleling the pseudonymous words, spoke a little more directly, albeit without authority. They spoke the real author's conviction and were the purpose of Kierkegaard's life work. Let me pause right here. Holmer is noting that in many of Kierkegaard's works, Kierkegaard writes literature where characters in the dramas portray his views, as opposed to writing in a more direct fashion. So back to the quote. Whereas all the rest of his writing was designed to get readers out of their mistaken conceptions, the discourses were the goal of the literature. Kierkegaard was a fan of Plato and the Greeks, and so the dialogues of Plato and their portrayal of Socrates, these dialogues, these character interactions, very much impressed Kierkegaard, and he modeled much of his writing after that style. Next slide. Now, we mentioned earlier a little bit of irony, and Kierkegaard's use of this, and, what is irony? Well, irony is a broad term, but generally speaking, you can think of some examples where there's a layer of indirection that invokes either a misdirection or a misleading of a turn of phrase or a statement, or employing an actual antithesis or direct opposite of a thing. So, for example, it's very popular today. If I have a question that I want to ask my friend and I feel uncomfortable asking him about it directly, then I might sort of ironically speak to him and say, hey, my friend has a question about this. What would you say to him? And so there's a level of indirection, there's a level of statement, and that's not necessarily strictly ironic, but it at least includes this idea that words can mean things other than, or connotate other than what they would literally mean or traditionally mean in a very linear, in a very thematic and direct writing style. And of course, with irony, you have the stating of opposing theses. But where you state an opponent's thesis and you agree with it in a contextual manner that provides indication to the reader that you actually disagree. So somebody comes to you and says, oh my, isn't President Trump the best president ever? And you secretly, of course, completely disagree with that thesis, for example, but rather than going into a fight, you might say something that's almost sarcastic, and you might say, oh yes, he is certainly something special. And so there's an irony. You're agreeing even though you disagree. And of course, to the degree, there's a subjective degree here that the other person may or may not pick up on. And that might be intentional. Now, that makes for good literature and interesting rhetorical devices, but imagine if the instruments of our daily life were ironic with us. Imagine if your street signs were ironic and you looked at them. So for example, you come to an intersection and there was an octagonal sign painted in red and it said stop ? That might be ironic. Are you supposed to stop? Are you not supposed to stop? What if you had subway signs, and you were on the subway and you want to know, am I supposed to get off on this stop or am I supposed to get off on the next stop? And the sign was ambiguous or maybe told you something that was wrong or completely opposite. Or imagine, the irony of trying to use something that should be legal tender but would not be accepted. So irony can be a tool of those who hold their opponents in contempt or who hold a different power dynamic. And so it's very often associated with deconstructive criticism or these caustic acids of modernity. And so for further fun and interesting examples of ironic thinking, Alanis Morissette's song is a great reminder and introduction. So I encourage you to listen to that. Next slide. Now let's talk about Kierkegaard from another perspective. This from the literary critic Mortimer Adler talking about him. And he saw Kierkegaard in this way. He said, man is essentially an individual and not a member of a species or a race. And ethical and religious truth is known through individual existence and decision, through subjectivity, not objectivity. Systems of thought and a dialectic, such as Hegel's, are merely matters of thought which cannot comprise individual existence and decision. Such systems leave out, said Kierkegaard, the unique and essential spermatic point, the individual, ethically and religiously conceived and existentially actuated. So whereas Marx very much created categories, a collective approach, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and where others have taken with that and gone onto these sort of identity, intersectionality, categories of identity. Kierkegaard really is an extreme individualist in this sense. Next slide. Adler continues. Similarly, in the works of American author Thoreau, writing at the same time as Kierkegaard, there is an emphasis on the solitary individual as the bearer of ethical responsibility, who, when he is right, carries the ethical weight against the state, government, and a united public opinion when they are wrong. The solitary individual with right on his side is always a majority of one. Next slide. Another contemporary friend of Kierkegaard says that Kierkegaard does not deny the fruitfulness or validity of abstract thinking, but he does deny any superstition that pretends that abstract theorizing is a sufficient argument for human existence. He holds it to be unforgivable to think that the impersonal can answer the vital problems of human life. Logical theorems, mathematical symbols, physical statistical laws can never become patterns of human existence. To be human means to be concrete, to be this person here and now in this particular and decisive moment, face to face with this particular challenge. So this is a very anti-systematic perspective that Kierkegaard is offering. Next slide. Now, in his own words, from this extreme individualness of the human subject, Kierkegaard perhaps approaches God in an extremely anthropomorphic way versus perhaps a scholastic or a classical theistic approach towards God, which wants to come up with these divine categories or this list of attributes, or think of your classic Reformed systematic theologies. So Kierkegaard wants to anthropomorphize God in a way that doesn't really allow these systematic approaches. So Kierkegaard here says, I conceive of God as one who approves in a calculated vigilance. I believe that he approves of intrigues. And what I've read of the sacred books of the Old Testament is not of a sort to dishearten me. The examples abundantly give evidence of a shrewdness which is nevertheless well-pleasing to God, and that at a later period Christ said to his disciples, These things I say not unto you from the beginning. I have yet many things to say unto you, but you cannot hear them now. So here is a theological suspension of the ethical rule of telling the whole truth. So against the systematicians and the classically orthodox, who would maybe offer these hermetically sealed, airtight, analytic statements about the character of God, or if you want to speak of it more colloquially, instead of putting God in a box, Kierkegaard here says that God is far too shrewd and smart to play by our theological rules. In other words, any expectations that we bring to God as a result of our abstract thinking about him are not binding on him, and he is free to be who he is, and he is not bound to be who our rules dictate he should be. Next slide. Either the first contains promise for the future, is the forward thrust, the endless impulse, or the first does not impel the individual. The power which is in the first does not become the impelling power, but the repelling power. It becomes that which thrusts away. Thus, for the sake of making a little philosophical flourish, not with the pen, but with thought, God only once became flesh, and it would be vain to expect this to be repeated. So here's an example of Kierkegaard's language, which can tend toward the irrational. We saw when we were looking at Nietzsche, how Nietzsche would use rhetorical flourishes that were irrational to make statements that were intended to stimulate responses in the reader more than they were intended to communicate, for example, dogmatic or systematic principles. And so here we find out that Kierkegaard has some ideas about God that are complicated and hard to express. Next slide. And so again, we talked about the modern age and the rapid pace of changes. So there were new tools, new specializations, old vocations went by the wayside, and many new specializations and vocations were created. There were new levels of education, awareness, scientific understanding around the world. There was a new philosophy from the universities that taught to question. However, it is fair to note that at the end of the day, all of the questions raised in the Enlightenment period seemed to be slightly masked forms of disbelief in traditional categories of restraint and moral values and religious claims. In other words, all of this new thought and this new philosophy and this new questioning, when you examine the values that replaced the traditional values, it was almost never the case that Enlightenment values restricted or restrained the human animal more so than the traditional religious categories before it. In other words, the Enlightenment seemed to be much more about throwing off restraint than it was in recalibrating, for example. And so I hope this is not too jaded an approach, but it is almost as if when Kant kicked off the Enlightenment revolution in philosophy, that he partitioned reality into phenomenal and noumenal aspects. It's almost as if he specifically did that so as to empty or drain the noumenal aspects from reality. And that's a nice practical way of saying, neuter God, remove the sting of the traditional categories of God as lawgiver and human beings as servants of the heavenly king, versus instead being their own autonomous sovereign subjects. Next slide. However, in throwing off the old categories of restraint, even Enlightenment thinkers were forced to admit the existence of this existential angst. And Kierkegaard found it in the Christian doctrine of original sin. Now, here's an interesting conundrum that sort of relates back to Kierkegaard as being this irrationalistic thinker. He wrote in such a way that depending upon your perspective and depending on the way you read him, sometimes you might read him and see him as an existentialist, but then at other times you might see him as an essentialist, which is the contrasting position to existentialist. And it's almost as if Kierkegaard's works are purposefully slippery so as to make things ambiguous on such points. More on this later. Before we go on there, I just want to say this. One of the great accomplishments in modern, mature literary forms is the introduction of ambiguity into plot and into conclusions. So think of these movies where the filmmaker makes a film where you watch it and the ending or conclusion or resolution of the drama is ambiguous. And so for folks, for example, who are familiar with the original Blade Runner film, and if you're not familiar, a spoiler is ahead. Please cover your ears for the next 30 seconds. Okay, I'll give you just a second to cover your ears. But seriously, in the original Blade Runner, as it was conceived and as it was released, there is a character who is hunting what are called replicants, or sort of automated robots who appear very much human and in human form. And this main character shows a unique skill. He sort of has a skill where he's able to hunt these robots or these replicants and identify them much more efficiently and quicker than other human beings are. And so he flourishes in that environment. And at the end of the film, as he eliminates the replicant and fulfills his mission, the thought comes into your mind, why is he so good at his job? And it's planted there. The idea or the question that is left ambiguous: is our robot hunter, our replicant destroyer, in fact himself a replicant? And so there's this beautiful introduction of ambiguity in, and you see this here in Kierkegaard. You can read him many ways, and legitimately so. And it's almost as if his writings are purposefully designed so that he is as slippery on such points as can be. Next slide. So what is Kierkegaard's approach in relationship to Christianity? How should we think of him? Should we commend him? Is he orthodox? Is he a philosopher? Is he a theologian? Is he a creative writer? Well, there's no easy box to put him in, frankly. There are great parallels with Nietzsche, but while Nietzsche was absolutely anti-theistic and atheistic, Kierkegaard is just as clearly absolutely Christian in his declared purpose and his declared allegiances. However, in terms of method, in terms of use, in terms of development of angst and other existential concepts, he indeed is quite parallel with Nietzsche. And you will find that he is a well-beloved, he might be the favorite philosopher theologian of Christians. Let me rephrase that. To non-Christians, he is often a favorite philosopher of theologians or theologian. So I apologize, I'm getting tongue-tied here. Let me go a little slower. If non-believers have read and have any relationship with any Christian theologian, it seems Kierkegaard is perhaps the most common, and for reasons that we'll talk more about here. But he is basically a non-believer's Christian idea of a theologian, a Christian theologian, and we will see why. Much of it has to do with Kierkegaard's Enlightenment point of view. So he is not part of he is a very unique Christian theologian in this sense, in that he is a product of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thought in a way that previous Christians were not. So there's an emphasis on Kierkegaard as outside. He's providing a criticism from outside of the tent. He's outside of the Christian tent looking in, although he is himself a Christian and inside of the tent. So he provides this Socratic critique. So it's very difficult to call him a proponent of Christianity or theologian in the traditional or pre-Enlightenment sense. Next slide. Like other thinkers, he seems to put philosophy in a higher place than theology, or at least than theological dogmas. Now, it's hard to classify his literary work in terms of any one genre, and yet he does argue in a manner for the truth of the Christian religion, but it is a religion that he sees himself outside of, and he despises in its earthly and visible form, and we'll go into why in just a few slides, especially where the church and the state are united or unified. And the example of his lifetime was the state Lutheran church in Denmark. And so Kierkegaard is also a lightning rod and a great buoyant example for any or all forms of anti-systemic Christianity. So if you run into people who are Christian but completely wish to reject the approach of, let's say, the classic reformers, Luther, Calvin, and further developments in Reformed theology and the creeds and the confessions and these ideas of systematic dogmas. If you're a Christian and you really have a beef against that kind of Christianity, Kierkegaard is your boy. And we will find indeed that some of the most intense critics of classical theology will use and study Kierkegaard to make points that are more or less insightful. So they may bring something to the table, whether or not it's sufficient to really overturn the role of dogma and systematic doctrine in Christianity is the arguable point. And so, think of the no creed but Christ folks, or other Christian believers who maintain a reputable or credible profession of faith, but just can't be bothered to think about Christianity as a deposit or as a body of systematic doctrine. And they find the whole effort to store the library of Christian riches and have some responsibility for maintaining it, they find it an unpalatable drag, a very distasteful sort of thing. And so Kierkegaard is their boy. Next slide. So how does Kierkegaard get across his points if he doesn't use the traditional creeds or confessions or systematic approaches? Well, he uses drama, irony, and a Socratic critical approach in his literature to examine, or the Socratic task. So he uses the acids of skeptical modernity to deconstruct the existing traditional frameworks. Now, this is not new to Kierkegaard, but an important aspect is that Kierkegaard isn't necessarily seeking to solve problems others have solved and to therefore have the better solution. So in theological discussions traditionally, you presented your argument and I presented my argument, and we theoretically examined each argument and then came upon a choice as to which would be better. However, Kierkegaard, again, can't be bothered to maintain or defend that whole library or deposit of Christian dogma. He's just not interested in doing it. And so he doesn't want to stop or take the argument to that terminal direction. Instead, he wants to induce aporia in his readers, and if he would be with you in person, in the conversation and in the discussion. And aporia is basically a word that sort of describes what happens when one person stumps another in an intellectual endeavor. So you and I are talking, and we're going back and forth, and we're using our rhetorical devices, and we're doing arguments, and then finally you pull out your trump card and you say something, and I'm caught flat-footed. I don't have an answer. Ha-ha, I've stumped you, you might say. Well, that's really the end of the game in Kierkegaard's book. Kierkegaard isn't interested in providing the answer that overcomes the aporia. He just is interested in saying, ha-ha, you've been stumped. You know, you have to admit defeat at this point. So this moves philosophy and theology into the game playing of the rhetorical. And so it becomes perhaps less and less about offering systematically consistent doctrinal positions and much more about winning the rhetorical battle. And so this is, debate tactics. This is using modes of speech. This is coming up with perhaps absurd or irrational plays that stump the other side into a stunned silence or a stunned submission. And so basically, in a word, perhaps Kierkegaard moves the debate from substance and toward style or attitude and optics. Next slide. In addition to that, this flourish for the rhetorical and this flourish away from defending a deposit of systematic doctrines strengthens rhetorical devices such as ad hominem and bulverism as cards to be played in the game of debate and interaction. This explains the drama of high school. So if you remember the drama that was those 4 to 6 years of high school, where there were cliques and there were social scenes and there were winners and there were losers, there were cool kids, and then there was the nerds, the geeks, the stoners and the losers, and however you want to partition that up. This is where these rhetorical games would tend to go, would tend to be less about acknowledged specialties and less about the truth of the underlying dogmatic positions, and much more about the game of who won the interaction. And so, think of it this way. My entire lifetime, when I've interacted with non-believers, there's sort of been this unwritten rule of the game where a believer is obligated to answer absolutely every question or every objection or every refutation that a non-believer proposes. Otherwise, Christianity must be abandoned as false. However, I've never been in a discussion where that was symmetrical. So, for example, when I've debated enlightened secularists and I've stumped them with my positions and with my arguments, they have never felt themselves to be under a similar burden. Science has never rested on their ability to give a good answer or not. And so their inability to answer a good point made by an opponent doesn't mean science is false. So we have this asymmetry. If non-believing friend A and I have a debate and he stumps me, well, obviously, there's this sort of default or bias-stoppel concept that Christianity has been refuted or defeated. Whereas, absolutely no one supposes that if I defeat my non-believing opponent in a debate interaction, that science must somehow be false. There's a whole host of other reasons why that might come to pass. And so this asymmetry, in large part, comes down to the fact that because of the influence of Kierkegaard and the direction of Enlightenment politics, for lack of a better word, in essence, we're back in high school when we're talking to each other. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Next slide. Now, Kierkegaard is also, in a sense, the disinterested critic. He himself has no skin in the game, and he feels free to focus entirely on the negative. So he advocates a form of Christianity, but he does not seek to defend it. He has no skin in the game. He doesn't feel obliged to answer for other Christians, for other Christian positions, especially pre-Enlightenment ones. He doesn't feel that it's his role to bring clarity necessarily. He brings his position to an interaction, and it's a take it or leave it kind of situation. He doesn't feel that he has to perhaps go past that. And so we see here the elevation in an archetypal way of the court jester to the role of truth speaker, speaking truth to power. And we see this not just in Kierkegaard, but really throughout the Enlightenment. What happens today in matters of public policy? Where are we going as a nation today? Well, largely we go where comedians, where late night talk show hosts, where entertainers, people who are not per se experts in particular branches of philosophy or science or other areas are speaking. However, it's the fast talking, smooth sounding hipster speaking truth to power. Or as Kierkegaard saw himself, as an incarnation of Socrates, as a gadfly, content to buzz around and object, never personally invested himself in defending anything of his own, and yet able to critically point the finger and laugh at anybody else. So he's free to press a grudge. And this sort of criticism is often associated with the internal psychological aspects of contempt. So in short, Kierkegaard is a person comfortable in his anthropomorphic skin. Or, in other words, he is naked and without shame, one might say, in his interactions. Next slide. So I've talked a lot about Kierkegaard, but we really haven't gone into some of his most important positions. And so I've put his picture up now in the slides to remind us that we're trying to dive into the thought and philosophy of Kierkegaard, whereas in the earlier slides, we were sort of talking about it in broad overview and maybe externally looking in. So one of the most famous aspects of Kierkegaard's thought is this development of blind faith. And so the debate between reason and faith, the antagonism between them, has a long history. And Kierkegaard, it existed before Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard played a very interesting and seemingly important role, however, in transforming the idea of the Christian view of faith, or the Christian position of faith, especially in the marketplace of ideas. So prior to Kierkegaard, in pre-Enlightenment thinking, when thinkers spoke about faith, they had a traditional view of faith articulated by theologians like, for example, but not limited to, Anselm. So Anselm had a phrase, and it was fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. Now, in a derogatory fashion, you could equate this with fake it till you make it, or faith as a placeholder, or understanding replaces it. So you stub out, you hold on to something by faith now, and then you find out later, 35 years later or 40 years later, that it was right for you to hold that, even though at the time you actually didn't have understanding of the doctrine. However, that's a negative view of it. That's not what Anselm was thinking of. So for Anselm, faith seeking understanding was volitional. It's a love for God, and it is a drive to act as God wills. So faith orients the individual towards God in the same way that buoyancy orients a cork to float in water, always moving it towards the surface. And so others have noted that faith seeking understanding begins with faith and not with doubt or suspension of belief. And here is another key aspect of contemporary interactions. When you come to a dialogue today with non-believers, there is a presumption, most generally, that they have the right to begin with a position of doubt or a position of suspension of disbelief in your thesis. And that turns out to be very caustic. And it also turns out to be very surprisingly not universal or uniform. So the same people who find it very hard to suspend their doubt or disbelief in interactions with Christian apologists can leave the debate forum, walk down to a movie theater, and suspend disbelief and watch a 2-hour movie that is supposedly set in a galaxy far, far away, or some other fantasy world. And so there's a real interesting dichotomy here. Prior to Kierkegaard, prior to the Enlightenment thinking, there really was a Christian emphasis that faith was a position of faith was a default requirement for subsequent intellectual inquiry. However, during this time, during Kierkegaard's life, during the Enlightenment era, this was replaced with the idea of faith as something that, well, let's just get into it and see how Kierkegaard talks about that. So Anselm sets out to convince the fool, that is, the person who has, in Psalm 14's famous characterization, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And so, prior to the Enlightenment, to hold faith as a prerequisite for intellectual inquiry was not only the default. If you didn't have faith, you had to overcome a presumption of foolishness. And so, if you think about this, Anselm sets off to argue from that basis, and he says this: If anyone does not know, either because he has not heard or because he does not believe, that there is one nature, then I think he could at least convince himself of most of these things by reason alone, if he is even moderately intelligent. In other words, the default presumption, according to Anselm, is a theistic presumption. And even a moderately intelligent person reasoning about the world has to start from this theistic presumption. Next slide. So here Anselm is offering faith as informed belief, as reasonable faith. We have the scriptures and we have the faculties of mind that are God-given, and a right use of them leaves no further obstacles between sinful man and God, and a knowledge of God, other than the obstacles the sinful man volitionally retains in his own nature. So that's basically a kind way of saying there's nothing between us and knowing God except our own will to not know him. And that's a sinful will. But this leaves those atheistically opposed to the Christian faith starting the discussion wearing the mantle of foolish and the stigma of foolishness. And so this is a very offensive notion. Secular thinkers didn't like this. They didn't want to start the discussion with the stigma, and it was seen as quite a disadvantage. This will change with Kierkegaard. Next slide. So, the theology of Kierkegaard introduces a new narrative, this faith as absurdity, faith as foolishness, faith as something that should not be the default mode of intellectual inquiry due to its unreasonable nature. So faith in the thought sphere was changed from the previous version of Anselm's faith seeking understanding to Kierkegaard's understanding of faith as blind leap and all the pejorative implications that implies. So this is a leap from the warm, calm, safe, and reasonable waters of humanistic and phenomenological understanding to the deep, dark, dangerous backward waters of irrationality and anti-science. Next slide. Faith is the leap into something absurd that in Kierkegaard's view yet triumphs over what is reasonable and rational. So Kierkegaard pits faith and reason as enemies, as opposites, and this is in line with the Enlightenment secularists who want no part of faith in their phenomenological worldview. Now, did Kierkegaard mean to do this when he set out his doctrine of faith? Not particularly clear. I don't think he meant to undermine Christianity. However, the nature of Western society's perception of faith has been permanently, I don't want to say irrevocably, but for the last 150 years, has completely changed to where faith is now the pejorative, and the foolishness of atheism in pre-Enlightenment thought is now the foolishness of theism in Enlightenment thought. Next slide. Now let's go into Kierkegaard's spheres of life. What does it mean to be a human? This is Kierkegaard looking inward. This is Kierkegaard mapping the inner man, just as the great explorers of the Age of Discovery mapped the Pacific Ocean, mapped the Indian Ocean, mapped the North America and South American continents, for example. So Kierkegaard is going to look at a map of the human being, and he's going to see three major spheres that are not entirely separate and yet not entirely the same. So three spheres, and we're going to talk about the three of them. And in some sense, they build upon each other in a sort of sense of progressing in maturity from one to the other. And yet, in all three of them, all three spheres remain and retain. So, well, let me just talk about these spheres and we'll go from there. So the first sphere is the sphere of the aesthete. And this is hard to pronounce word, but you can also think of it as the aestheticist, or the person who lives aesthetically, who lives for beauty, who lives to seek pleasure. And one of the fundamentals of this pleasure-seeking, aesthetic-seeking person is the despair, the sickness of spirit in the human condition. And so in your low, common, or vulgar person, the vulgar pleasure seeker, you have the person who lives life to overindulge. You have the glutton. You have the sexually promiscuous. You have the dense and unsophisticated person, the unmalleable masses, the mass of people who are just hot messes, and you really can do nothing profitable with them. So you have this idea of the mass man, or the common man, or the vulgar man as a puppet, who is very self-unaware, who is almost like a herd animal. And in a sense, when you start from this perspective and this way of thinking, they are in some important ways a failure as a human being, something to have contempt toward and to not want to be like them. Next slide. Now, from this low, vulgar form of overindulgence, Kierkegaard noted that you could still live an aesthetic life, a pleasure-seeking life, where you turned inward, where you became aware of your own self-conscious, where you were awakened to the social order, that you lived in a community, and that you were among other people. And so at a high level, you could be a master pleasure seeker. So life exists as a ground to express the enjoyment of its possibilities. So the performance of art, the enjoyment of literature, the individual pursuit of excellences, words and deeds fitly spoken and acted upon, enjoying the thrill of the chase, but not enjoying being pinned down by it. And so in this stage of life, Kierkegaard thought of commitment as a negative. So this master pleasure seeker, this high-level aesthete, lived his life in a committal way. So he was never tied down to being an artist, or never committed to producing certain works or going through certain stages. This there's sort of the idea here of indulging in pleasure in this fanatical hope of this endless journey from star to star. So one enemy of this pursuit are serious relationships and the consequential commitments. They act as chains that limit the aesthete's freedom in the chase for life's elements. So if you think of the book and the movie Carpe Diem, seize the day, go out and suck the marrow out of life, enjoy life, seize upon its pleasures. This is very much the Kierkegaardian aesthete. Don't be pinned down. Don't be committed. Don't be a sheep. Next slide. Now, this is somewhat autobiographical, as at one point Kierkegaard was in a very serious relationship with a woman. However, being and living as an aesthete, he himself could not marry his intended girlfriend, for he saw that the marriage to this woman of his life would impede what he needed to be free to do. How can you be a master pleasure seeker when you're bound by the chains of marriage? Yet the break was hard. The pull of marriage was not an easy thing to escape. Friendship is dangerous, Kierkegaard said. Marriage, even more so. Next slide. Okay. And yet, even as you've moved from the vulgar or common aesthetic approach to this high approach, there still remains angst. The human condition is still desperate. In Kierkegaard's mind, this was a conviction of original sin, and there was a nihilistic indifference. Something's wrong. Becoming one's authentic self seems somehow inauthentic. So think of the despair, you Reformed Christians, on this lecture session. Think of reading Ecclesiastes. The author there embodies the search for the high aesthete, and yet remains unsatisfied, filled with guilt and an existential loathing of one's self and one's condition. And so the aesthetic sphere, the aesthetic condition, is ultimately an unsatisfying one. And this spurs Kierkegaard to the second of our three spheres, to move from the realm of the aesthetic to the realm of the ethical. Next slide. So now Kierkegaard is talking about the ethicist, and he's talking in a new sphere, which is different from the aesthete, which we just looked at. And so here, it's the meaning one achieves by following rules, by doing one's duty, by doing studied exertion in things like work and vocational work that involves commitments one fulfills. The ethicist immerses himself in and engages with the social order. He's a responsible member of society. And here, freedom of choice he has to be what one chooses to be, not guided by pleasure as was guided in the aesthetic sphere, but instead there is an alignment with a commitment to the society he lives in. Think of Kant's categorical imperatives, Kant's ideas of duty, and you'll have an idea perhaps here of what Kierkegaard is getting at. So you have family life, you have social status, wealth and power, veneration and prestige, all of the things in life that come with commitment and study and hard work, and the journey where you delay your gratification in the present in order to reap success in the future. Next slide. And so we have Kierkegaard in the second sphere, this ethical sphere. But here's the question: does becoming this ethicist allow one to find one's self, or to authentically become what one is to become? So, for example, let's say you take your place in society. Well, societies may be more or less virtuous, more or less diseased. And so the ethicist, as Kierkegaard noted, may just be a cog in an evil and oppressive society or system. And you have to ask yourself, what's the virtue in that? Next slide. And finally, ultimately, the ethicist is only the master of the finite and the temporal. He's a big fish in a small pond, but that's nothing in scale to compare with the infinite and with the eternal. What profit does a person have to be a big fish in a small pond and yet ultimately not be integrated with the infinite and eternal? Next slide. And so at the end of all of these efforts, the ethicist has fallen into the same angst and despair that the aesthete did. So this is the same withering spirit. And this is likely where Kierkegaard saw the death of Christianity in traditional orthodoxy. So state churches, for example, which he hated. You know, think of your classic orthodoxies. Think of the creeds. Think of the confessions. Think of the things that Reformed Christians have defended for centuries. Kierkegaard saw all this as being in the ethical sphere, but ultimately meaningless. It was dead. It was lifeless. It was not vibrant. It was the husk or shell of a thing that was once alive. Now it's a rotting, lifeless corpse into which ethicists wish to insert themselves. Next slide. And so this, we see here Kierkegaard articulating something that's going to be very important in Reformed orthodoxy, for it was 70 or 80 years later, it was the study of Kierkegaard by theologian Karl Barth and his agreement with Kierkegaard that traditional orthodoxy, so Barth was against liberalism in his day, but while he was against liberalism, he was not satisfied with traditional orthodoxy. And the reason why is he felt, like Kierkegaard, that it was dead, it was lifeless, it was a rotting corpse. And so Barth looked for a third way or a mediating way between Protestant liberalism and orthodoxy. And he developed it. And it was based upon these existential concepts of Kierkegaard and the Enlightenment. And so this new neo-orthodoxy that in Barth's mind and in Kierkegaard's mind discards the empty corpse of rotting scholasticism and the high Calvinism of Luther, Calvin, and the Reformers. Next slide. Now, here we are, and the ethicist has fallen into the same despair as the aesthete, and there is no hope. And yet, just as the light gets the darkest, just as we have come to a stage of one's life journey where all is dark and there is no hope, it is precisely then at that stage that the light of faith comes to dispel the darkness of existential angst. Next slide. So we move into the third sphere, and this is the sphere of the religious. And here, the main concept in this sphere is that in the religious sphere, a person taps into or relates to or links to or becomes one with the infinite transcendent source. And so the person attains a synthesis of the finite and infinite and becomes the authentic self. Now I'm going to say this quote. This is my quote, not Kierkegaard's quote, so please let me be careful. But if I can summarize, he is relating self to one's self in the search for being's one's self. Now, I'm not completely sure if I'm being charitable or faithful here, but I want to point out, you remember how with Nietzsche, when we looked at this, Nietzsche's absolute obsession with self, well, it's an Enlightenment obsession, and Kierkegaard's got it too. Now, there's a concern that Kierkegaard's religious affections, his Christianity, is phenomenological. Is Kierkegaard entering into a true religious relationship with Christ? Well, he thought so, and yet the denomination of self, relating to self in the manner of Enlightenment thinkers, brings Kierkegaard's whole enterprise into doubt. Or put another way, we're not so sure that this is actually Christianity. Next slide. Now, continuing in Kierkegaard's religious sphere, think of pictures from the Middle Ages that used a halo, and you get an idea of what Kierkegaard is trying to portray in this religious sphere. So the halo in medieval art was an attempt to portray, using a light around the head, to portray the spiritual condition of the individual as being exceptionally high and exceptionally close to God. Or as Kierkegaard might have suggested, the halo represents an interaction the individual has who has engaged with the transcendent, infinite, and eternal source. It's a very religious concept. However, it's not unique to Christianity. So you can see art from Buddhism, pictures of enlightened ones from Buddhism, or Hinduism's exalted beings, etc. And you can see the same halos with them. So this concept of a religious sphere is not necessarily a Christian one. So it's an unusual sphere for the Reformed to consider. And yet, it's not clear. If we are careful, if we are generous and charitable in reading Kierkegaard, it's not clear that immediately that he's unorthodox. Now let's continue. In further thinking about the religious person, the key here is to recognize that in exerting one's efforts as an aesthete or as an ethicist, one is simply acting in a worldly fashion, even as it irrationally at the time seemed that one was being one's free and authentic self. And so Kierkegaard employs this idea of the knight of infinite resignation, who resigns himself to the irrational idea that to be free, one must renounce one's self-autonomous impetus and instead lose one's self in the eternity and infinite of the very world he had previously sought to transcend. Or put another way, to transcend the world, one must resign one's self to not acting to transcend the world, and one must lose himself in the resigning of one's self to the darkness of despair, so as to gain the light of faith, and thus transcend and become. And if I'm losing you at this point, please be patient with me. But at least you get the sense of why so many people have categorized Kierkegaard's thinking as irrational. This is very dense and hard to penetrate. And yet, there's something here to think about. Next slide. So for Kierkegaard, faith, instead of being faith in the sense that Anselm talked about, faith contains two movements, or faith is attained to by two movements within the human being, the movement of infinity and the movement of finitude. And so earlier, with the aesthetic sphere, we talked about all the potential for pleasure, all the ideals that existed, when humankind was nothing but pure potential. When we were young, when we were just born, when we were babies and we had our whole lives ahead of us, we had so much potential to become absolutely everything and anything. And yet, when one becomes the religious person, moves out of the aesthetic sphere, out of the ethical sphere, and into the religious sphere, one recognizes that many things that seemed possible or ideal in those spheres, in fact, are not possible in light of the process of discovery, in the light of living life. And the knight of faith resigns himself from the impossible. So we will have an example of this, because this is very, if you can't see this, Kierkegaard, this is very abstract thought, the very sort of abstract thought that Kierkegaard dogmatically rejected in other Christian theologians. Nevertheless, we continue here. The movement of infinity. So Kierkegaard describes how the love for pleasure or love for a committed relationship with another, which were so important in the ethical spheres, is transformed to a love of the eternal being. For some reason, Kierkegaard doesn't seem to want to say God here, or maybe that's the secular writers not wanting to say God here. Leave it as eternal being. However, he gives an example of a genuine love a man might feel for a woman, but due to the circumstances of society or previous commitment, must remain separate and unmarried. So think of the married man who falls in love with another woman. Now, he finds himself in love and with all the impulses to fulfill and consummate the love that a man can have for a woman. However, he is committed to his wife, and therefore there is a higher pleasure from abstaining from that seduction, from abstaining from the relationship, leaving the thrill, leaving the chase of the pleasure and the consummation that the aesthete valued earlier. And so he's abandoning the earlier values of the aesthete and ethicist. He is a pilgrim, he is a stranger passing through the finite on the way to the infinite. Next slide. And so in one movement, the movement of infinitude, now is balanced by a movement of finitude. And here we have faith that what was renounced in the movement of infinity will yet be regained. And he is convinced that his highest earthly hope will be maintained. So think about that love relationship. He gave up that love that he had for another woman because of his commitment to his wife. And so the idea here is that in the movement of finitude, what he has given up to God, he receives back again as God restores that relationship between that married man and that woman who was not his wife, except that it is now restored in a clean and wholesome way, in a godly way. So it's not consummated in a carnal sense, but it is a relationship brought back into rightness. And so it is this synthesis of opposites that might instinctively sound right, yet it is not easy or even perhaps possible to rationally account for this. And so this is a neo-orthodoxy that sort of embraces paradox or antimony. Next slide. So let me give some examples here. This is very dense and difficult without them. Kierkegaard cites as an example man of religion from the scriptures Abraham. So Abraham offers his son Isaac, and in Kierkegaard's view, as he offers his son, he resigns himself to the loss with the faith that he will receive his son back. So this is the positive. This is the man of faith, Abraham. And so Abraham, as he goes to fulfill and end the life of his son, he secretly and with faith knows that God will restore that son to him. And so that's an example of the man of faith. And in another example, this one is an example of a man failing to become a man of faith. Jesus tells the rich young ruler to sell all that he has. Come follow me and find the true riches. And here the rich young ruler fails the test of faith, and he goes away sad at the request made of him. What happened? The rich young ruler valued the lower riches more than he valued the higher riches. So we have the authentic knight of faith. But what would such a knight look like in daily life? Would he be armed with a sword and a lance, riding a righteous steed? And does he battle evil valiantly? Now, my apologies, friends. We are over time here, and I apologize for that. We are in the home stretch, so we are just down to the last 8 or 9 slides. So I apologize for going over, and I thank you very much for bearing with me here. So let me just continue on. So Kierkegaard imagines what this knight looks like. What does a man of faith look like? And how can you tell him apart from other people? And the image that comes to Kierkegaard's mind and astonishes him is this image of a tax collector, the man of the herd, the mass man, the robot man, who was so despised by the early aesthete. And so outwardly, this man looks just like the rest of the crowd. Inwardly, he has made the movement of infinity. He can enjoy the finite without being limited by it. His infinitude allows him to transcend, and in fully becoming the infinite mass man outwardly, he is a sovereign singularity of free choice synthesized with the necessity of nature. And so, if this sounds very hard to pin down, think of Christ. So the scriptures speak of Christ having a beauty, an external beauty that was nothing special. In Isaiah, it speaks of Christ that, he had nothing special in his countenance or no special beauty in his person that we would otherwise esteem him or differentiate himself from others. And yet, on the inside, he's the very Son of God. Next slide. Kierkegaard needs to forgive. We have to wrestle with Kierkegaard, and we have to possibly forgive him if his descriptions seem irrational to his readers and to those contemplating his ideas. At the end of the day, he's proposed these spheres, but we have to ask ourselves, is he deluded? Is he deceived? Is Kierkegaard providing astonishing insight, or is it just a fool's folly? Now, Kierkegaard admits that in presenting his religious sphere, he is not certain, and even yet here he remains anxious. He is convinced and convicted of the truth of his approach, and yet admits that it can seem offensively wrong and incorrect to others. I should also add, it can also seem irrational. It can sound like nonsense, can sound like gobbledygook. Next slide. And so Kierkegaard admits that his approach contains an objective uncertainty one cannot know via demonstration or intellectual inquiry. So you cannot know outside of living this life that the insights are correct, or even distinguish them from the insights of a madman. Think of Nietzsche and how he went crazy with this existential burden. And yet, the risk of faith is what it is. And Kierkegaard commends his approach, even as he notes that those who have expectations of certainty or rational validation or instinctual feelings of rightness will find that their existential condition remains unresolved. In other words, one just has to decide, well, this is the way life is, and live accordingly. Next slide. We are almost through. And my, again, apologies for going over. Finally, we just take a look at Kierkegaard as the existentialist. So this is mostly recap. We've talked about these themes. The human life is a synthesis of opposites, the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal, the freedom of will with the necessity of determinism. And we talked about the crisis of modernity, identity, meaning, values, origin, what to believe in this very confusing new world. Next slide. And so, as a result of this, there are actually existential psychologists today who offer that for some cases of anxiety and depression, patients are not just merely suffering from a chemical or biological imbalance in the person. Rather, their condition results from the fundamental inability to cope or psychologically live in the world in which we live in. And Kierkegaard, as we noted before, thought this was a manifestation of the guilt of original sin. And finally, last slide, an evaluation. Let's go back. We asked this in an earlier slide. What is Kierkegaard's approach in relationship to Christianity? Is he a philosopher? Is he a theologian? Is he a creative writer? We noted the parallels with Nietzsche. We noted his his Socratic approach. And it's really hard to call Kierkegaard a theologian in a traditional sense. And so we may nominally title him so because he wrote about theological issues, but he's not a defender of the faith. He's not an apologist. He just is. Now, here's my evaluation. Can we call him a Christian phenomenologist? Now, I am tempted to call him a Christian roller coaster, a fun ride, an insightful critic, a literary genius, but not a reputable deposit of Christian dogma. Do you see how Kierkegaard, with his fears, had to throw out and wanted to throw out all of the orthodox traditional language in favor of this entire new glossary of terms and approaches? So, to be fair, Kierkegaard never thought he was being a reputable deposit of Christian dogma in the classic sense. What did he think he was? Well, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't make him a doctor of the church. Let's put it that way. And while I believe he's a believer and I believe he's a Christian, I would say that his theology ultimately has to stand outside the bounds of orthodoxy. So that's the evaluation. That's a complicated man in a very short overview. So we've reached the end of the slides here, and I thank you so much for your patience with me as we've gone over significantly tonight, and I apologize for that. But let's go to questions.
So, ask you this. So, I'll admit that I came a little prepared, knowing a little bit of what you were going to say. I'm gonna read a short section from a book review of Kierkegaard's Provocations, which is a collection of some of the spiritual writings that was put together by the Bruderhof, the people who put out the Plough, and they put out these little small books of writings by well-known philosophers. And so this book review came from the Prolegomena, which is from September 2000, which is Prolegomena is sort of the academic magazine of Dordt University. And so this writer says about Kierkegaard, from a reformational perspective, Kierkegaard can be criticized for his individualism. And the reason I'm going to read this little section is you talked, especially early on in the lecture, about individualism. And so I'm just going to kind of ask you to react to the writer. So again, from a reformational perspective, Kierkegaard can be criticized for his individualism. That criticism often takes an unfair turn. Kierkegaard was not an individualist in the Enlightenment sense, far from it. Rather, his stress on the authenticity of the individual is a reaction to the corporate hypocrisy that he experienced within the official Danish Lutheran Church. It diminished his perception and understanding of the body of Christ. This point becomes more apparent when one considers Kierkegaard's concern the biblical teachings on suffering for righteousness' sake, self-denial, and on radical servanthood. And then goes on to quote, this is a quote from Kierkegaard, where he writes, Christ willed to be the socially insignificant one. The fact that he descended from heaven to take upon himself the form of a servant, not an accidental something, which now is to be thrust into the background and forgotten. No, every true follower of Christ must express existentially the very same thing. Insignificance and offense are inseparable from being a Christian. As soon as the least bit of worldly advantage is gained by preaching or following Christ, the fox is in the chicken house. Then the reviewer goes on to write, it might be argued that Kierkegaard is one with reformational thinking on the topics of the sovereignty of God and the creaturely finitude of humankind. Accepting this argument, one also begins to see that Kierkegaard is far from being the irrationalist he is thought to be. I realize there's a lot there that I'm asking you to sort of comment on, but I just wonder, and if it's unfair to take that whole thing, was there anything in that sort of more positive criticism of Kierkegaard's writing that either, and I'll let go either way, that either rings some truth with you, or that you feel like is a misread of Kierkegaard?
That's a great question. I'm so glad you read that. That was well done and well considered. Let me put it this way. Kierkegaard did not wish to wear the mantle of a systematic theologian. And in desiring to not do that, it's not a sin. So for example, we can look at Augustine. Augustine wrote in a non-systematic form in his literary works, and he never pretended that he was systematizing articles of the faith, and no one looks back at Augustine and says, he's an invalid doctor of the church because he didn't write in this systematic style. And so in a sense, Kierkegaard can be said to be the same way. In that sense, I'm sympathetic to Kierkegaard as having a right place in the Christian church. I would say, he's a believer. I would say he's very thoughtful, insightful where he is insightful, and worth considering. I think my only concern would be, what are we to think as people speaking and proclaiming the truths of Christianity? What are we to think about indirect methods such as Kierkegaard's literary forms? Again, I talk about, imagine if the spirit of Kierkegaard was used in stop signs. Instead of giving us theses, we would be given, these verbal riddles. And, you get on the subway and you'd ask, where am I? And, Siri would answer you, where is anybody ever really? And just go on this existential quest. We sort of rely upon Christian dogma to provide a reliable infrastructure by which Christians can live their lives. And So in that sense, I would not commend Kierkegaard, for example, to new believers, to people still learning the doctrines and dogmas of the faith. Now, I would say to the mature and seasoned Christian believer, think of the believer who's studied the scriptures for 20 years or more and has a very firm grasp of the essential doctrines and a doctrinal commitment. I think there can be great benefit in reading Kierkegaard for him being what he is, just like you can get great benefit reading Augustine. And it's no sin that he didn't write the way Reformed people, for example, write. But at the same point in time, there's a lot of statements that are very difficult to parse. There is this overemphasis upon self that seems at times almost perhaps anti-biblical. The Bible speaks to us to empty ourselves of self and to trust in the Lord our God with all our heart and lean not upon our own understanding. And so if we started a self-centered approach to young believers in the faith, I would guess Kierkegaard would do more harm than good. And I think that might be one reason why the secularists and the anti-systematic Christians value him so highly. He is sort of the antithesis of confessional or Reformed theology. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I kind of wanted to just get your reaction to that, because I think, as you've noted throughout, I think one of the interesting things about Kierkegaard is that there's such a wide array of views on Kierkegaard among Christians, and which is something that I just find kind of fascinating about him. And he is not easy to read. He doesn't himself to just simply taking little bits of he writes and and figuring out where he's at. The same author early on in the review said Kierkegaard's writings present readers, especially readers in English, with numerous obstacles before one even penetrates to the level of content. And it goes through and lists them. And that's absolutely true, and that's what makes it hard to get at what he's saying. But I think it is useful. Then I think you're right that when we read him, we have to read him what he is, and he is not a systematic theologian by any means. He's more of sort of a critic, maybe, and a critic who speaks in not necessarily in always direct language, maybe like some of the Old Testament prophets, shall we say, but without rising, certainly without rising to the level. I wonder. You asked, how did Kierkegaard see himself? I wonder whether that's how Kierkegaard saw himself, not as inspired, as an inspired prophet, as somewhat of a prophet who was there to speak to sort of the discourse that was happening at that time, to criticize it, without necessarily saying, and now let's list out all the possible answers. And I wonder if that's, I'm going to have to read more of Kierkegaard. I mean, most of my understanding of Kierkegaard has been from secondary sources, but my daughter has been buying me, for Father's Day and for my birthday and things like that, little volumes of Kierkegaard. So I'm going to for myself.
Oh, you're in for some joy, as well as some good father-daughter time.
Well, and actually, we had a little bit of discussion again, because that whole, those three spheres. She took a philosophy class this summer, at Dordt University, and there was one of the lectures was just on those three, and then she was required to get a paper on how she perceived those three, and sort of give examples of if you accept that sort of framework, what are some people that might fit into those three categories, and she took to that assignment with some gusto.
Oh, that's awesome. It was interesting about his life. His older brother was a high clergyman in the Danish state church, if I remember correctly. And so Kierkegaard had the position of someone with great familiarity with the inner workings of the Danish state church, and yet he was not inside the church himself, yet he was very familiar with it. And so, think of Kierkegaard as a person who doesn't think of him as a critic of a restaurant where his brother owns, and he's been in the kitchen and he absolutely won't eat there because he has seen what the kitchen looks like. And that's my own private analogy of how to think about Kierkegaard. He's commenting from a privileged position within the church, and yet he's commenting outside of the church. So there's a contradictoriness there to it, or if not a contradictoriness, there's a manifold sense associated with it. And that, I think, maybe describes him in terms that a lot of people today might understand. And just like, the old saying is you never eat at a restaurant where you've worked in the kitchen. So too, after reading Kierkegaard, he's hard on a lot of, he is a very critical voice of traditional Christian orthodoxy. I wonder how he and his brother got along, actually, in light of his criticisms.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to know. Interesting.
All right. Wow. What a long session. An intense one. That surprised me. I didn't expect it to be that long when I was preparing it, but there was just so much to say about this seminal figure. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thanks again for joining the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. This is Romans 9:1-8.